Okay, carrying on with Unity basics. We just looked at the layout of the window itself, and now we're going to look at how we can actually add some objects, maybe edit some objects, and just get into the real basics of starting to develop scenes in Unity. Uh, by default, we'll be inside of our first scene. It's called Sample Scene. All right, we're not going to worry about changing the name or anything just yet, but you'll notice that we are just in this basic scene that we use to start. Um, when we want to add a part or a piece to Unity, something that's not imported, like a Blender object, for example, if we want to just add a default object from within Unity, we have some options. Up at the top, we have Game Object. That's the menu at the top, Game Object. And anytime you want to add something to a scene that you don't have currently or you want to add on to your scene, you would go up to Game Object. And there's a lot to choose from. All right, and I'm not going to go through any of these in this video. We're simply going to go through one menu called 3D Object. And what 3D Object is basically pretty self-explanatory. 3D objects that will get added to your scene. So if I want to create sort of a nice starting point or a play area, what I might do is add something like a plane. And a plane is just a flat object that could represent a floor or the ground or whatever. So I'm going to click the plane, and you will see that the plane gets added to the scene. And by default, it comes in at a set size of 111. You can see that over here in the scale. We're just going to move it down a little bit. And what we can do is, by switching to game view, we can see if that plane is even inside of our camera. So what I might do to start is using the camera, get it to a position where I can kind of see the plane in a nice centered way. All right, and the way that I did that is I just took the plane, I moved it down a little bit in the y-axis here. Then I clicked my camera using the the transform tool, and I just rotated it a little bit on the x-axis like that and just sort of centered it. All right. You can see in game view now that we can actually see the plane in front of us. All right. And while the plane is selected, we've got all these options that come up along the right-hand side. And I'm not going to go into crazy detail on this yet. We'll get into it. But we got all sorts of things like, can this object cast shadows? You know, will this cast shadows onto other objects? Will it receive shadows from other objects? Will it contribute to the illumination of the scene? Right? We'll skip a bunch of these. This one down here, we're going to get into later. It's called colliders. Down here, we got materials. We're going to talk about all this stuff. But for now, let's just build a few game objects. So we got a plane. Then we're going to go create object. I'll make a cube. There's a cube. All right, and then maybe I'll add something like a sphere. You can kind of see the different objects that are in here. You can see as I'm adding them, they're getting added to the list here because it's showing us everything that's in the scene. All right, and then maybe I'll add one more. Let's say a cylinder. It's got all the sort of basic shapes here. If I switch to the game view, you can see all three lined up nicely. All right. And again, if we want to get a better view, we can always zoom in. We can kind of rotate around them just to kind of get a better view of what's happening. All right, so you can see that is how you would add some basic objects to your scene. All right, and it's quite easy to add objects, and we can use objects. Objects can represent whatever we want. So if we're building a game, and let's say we want to use the cube, for example, as our player, just because we're testing, we can assign the cube as our player for now and then swap them with an actual model or mesh later on. No problem. All right, so blocks and shapes are really good as starting points for other objects or more complex objects later on. The other thing I want to mention is when you have an object selected, so let's say it's the cube, you will notice again that you've got all sorts of options here as far as position, rotation, and scale go. And I'm just going to change a few of these numbers, okay? So position's pretty obvious. It's going to change where this object is in sort of relativity to the center of the scene. And if you go over the X, the Y, or the Z and you just click and drag, you can slide along that with your mouse and just kind of change its position sort of dynamically, or you could punch in an exact amount. For rotation, same idea. We can rotate that object around its center point. We can change that center point as well. It doesn't have to be in the middle, but we'll talk about that later. And so we can rotate that object if we wish as well. I'm going to set that back to 0. The last one is probably the most important, and that's the scale. And right now, a block really, there's not much you can do with. It's a single block of maybe a larger world. But a block doesn't have to be a block. For example, if we scale in the x-axis, a block can become a wall, or it can become an obstacle. The y, same deal. We can make it a tall pillar, or a part of, again, of a taller wall if we do both, right? You can see how this is changing the shape of the object by scaling in just a single axis. All right, and so there's a lot you can do with this. You can take a cube and really, oops, I shouldn't have put 0 because then it doesn't exist. 1, 1, 1. There we go. And you can really modify it and change it to whatever you want. And so that again is very important, because in order to make levels, for example, you have two options. You can go and build something in another program like Blender. You can build all your pieces and all your assets, or you could build your entire level there if you really wanted to. But it's more efficient to build it inside here and import the little assets like the houses and the trees and stuff like that from another program, rather than building an entire world in another program. All right, so getting comfortable with these basic primitive shapes is important. Let's say we wanted to make something more complex. All right, so I'm actually going to delete this plane that's down here. Right, I have it selected, and there's two ways you can do this. I mean, there's probably more than two ways. You can go right here in the list, just right click and delete it. All right, you can do that here too. You can hit delete on the keyboard. Oh, that didn't work. Let's just go with this by right clicking and hit delete and get rid of it. All right, we still have our primitives. There they are. But we no longer have a plane underneath. All right, so let's say we wanted to design a world that these blocks were inside of. All right, there's a couple of really cool options for that. And one of the built-in options that is really fun to play around with is the terrain editor. All right, so under game object, if we go to 3D object, you will see terrain. All right, you'll also see other things like trees and wind zones and stuff. Some of these you can't actually see. They're just areas that are designated, like the wind zone, for example. But terrain is a really cool one. If you add a terrain, it's gonna load this massive plane. All right, and like I said, it's massive. Okay, the whole idea of the terrain is that it is a base map for your world that you're creating, and you can see it's huge. All right, we can't even see those little primitives. They're way over in the corner here. All right, really lost in comparison to this terrain. However, we will be looking at this in more detail in a bit. With the terrain, you have some really interesting options over here. You can create a terrain simply by painting what you want on it. And I'm going to show you how this works. It's kind of cool. Ignore the create neighbor terrains. That's a whole different thing we'll talk about later. But if you go to paint terrain, you're going to get some basic brushes. And you will notice that these brushes, well, the ones I have set right now are massive. So I will bring the size down on that brush to something a little more manageable so you can actually see what it's doing. So you'll notice that it creates this sort of highlight over the terrain object. You can also change the opacity. This is how strong the effect is going to be. But when I click, you can see that I can create mountains, for example. I can create hills. And the longer I click and hold, the higher the terrain is going to become. I can also hold shift and lower the terrain if I wish. Okay, now you'll notice that the terrain will not go below its starting point. In order to get, let's say, like a river, for example, so you'd have like a low spot, what you need to do is you actually need to move your terrain. All right, so we got to find the middle of this terrain. We got to move it up like that. All right, and get back to our little mountains that we had started over here. And then when we go with the terrain editor and hold shift, we should, oh, that didn't work either. Okay. I'll have to come back on that one because there is a way to do it. It's just you have to change the height of the object. I forget the exact sort of way to set that up, but we will come back to that. But you can see that by painting, I can build an entire map. I could build an entire world. And this is way more efficient just because Unity will load a terrain object faster than it would if you brought in an entire map from another program. All right, so it's kind of cool to create a terrain this way. All right, another couple options is the paint trees. We will talk about this in a later video. I'm going to go into the terrain editor a lot more detail later. You can also paint grass and details. You can also adjust your terrain settings. There's a lot you can do here, and we'll get into that in a more detailed video later on. But for now, I just want you guys to be aware of these objects that you'll find under Game Object and what they allow you to add. And we will build on this in a later tutorial. Before we close this video, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete the terrain. And I'm going to go back to our original 3 and I'm going to re-add the plane that we started with. And I might move it down a little bit because it's probably too high. Let's just take a quick look. That looks great. All right, so stick with me till the next one. We're going to go into a little more advanced materials and dynamics a little more. All right, see you on the next one.